On a warm September morning in 1994, the small town of Ruwa in Zimbabwe moved at its usual gentle pace. The air was still heavy with the lingering heat of the African sun, and the sounds of distant birds carried softly over the landscape. Life in Ruwa followed a rhythm that felt timeless. Farmers worked their fields, children in neat uniforms walked to school, and families prepared for another day shaped by both tradition and modern life. It was in this setting, calm and unhurried, that the Ariel school children would soon encounter something extraordinary, something that would ripple across decades and continents. The Ariel school itself sat in a rural but not isolated environment, surrounded by open fields and patches of bushland that stretched out into the horizon. For the children who studied there, break times meant running across open ground, laughing, chasing, and gathering in small groups beneath the tall grasses or under the shade of scattered trees. On the morning of September 16th, the students spilled out into the schoolyard for recess. Teachers were inside, tending to their tasks, leaving the children to enjoy a brief stretch of freedom under the wide African sky. What happened next would become one of the most documented and puzzling encounters in modern UFO history. As the children played, their attention was drawn to something strange in the distance beyond the school grounds. At first, it was just a glimmer, something out of place against the familiar line of trees and brush. Some of the younger children stopped and stared, curious, while others carried on until the murmurs of their classmates drew them closer. Slowly, the playful energy shifted into a quiet, collective focus. Children began to notice a shiny metallic object descending, almost settling near the scrubland, just outside the perimeter. The object seemed unlike anything they had ever seen. No ordinary aircraft, no familiar machine from their daily lives. The account of this moment carries a surreal calm. The schoolyard, once filled with laughter, hushed into an almost dreamlike silence. Many of the children later described the object as a craft, silver and disc-like, hovering or resting on the ground. But it was not just the craft that unsettled them. Figures emerged, beings that appeared small, with large heads and deep black eyes, moving in ways that did not fit with the human form. Their presence created an atmosphere that was at once fascinating and terrifying. The children, caught between the innocence of imagination and the sharp clarity of lived experience, watched with a mixture of awe and fear. Some children recalled that the beings communicated without words, a feeling that thoughts were somehow placed directly into their minds. The messages, according to many testimonies later, carried warnings about the earth, about the environment, about the way humanity was treating its home. Others simply remembered the fear, the strange silence, and the overwhelming sense that they were in the presence of something completely beyond their understanding. This opening moment, the calm of an ordinary school morning shattered by the extraordinary, would mark the beginning of a mystery that has endured for decades. It is a story that begins quietly, almost like a dream, and expands into one of the most intriguing and debated UFO encounters of modern times. From here, the path of the narrative leads deeper, into cultural context, psychology, investigations, and the wider implications of what those children claimed to see under the bright Zimbabwean sun. To understand why the events at Ariel School resonated so deeply, we must first step back and picture Zimbabwe as it was in the 1990s. This was a country living in a period of both possibility and struggle, shaped by the weight of its recent past and the uncertainty of its future. Just over a decade earlier, in 1980, Zimbabwe had gained independence after a long and bitter liberation war against colonial rule. The nation was still relatively young, still working to define itself after the transition from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. Its people were trying to balance the echoes of a colonial legacy with the pressing need to build a stable, modern society. That tension colored nearly every aspect of life: schools, politics, culture, and even how extraordinary events were perceived. By 1994, the economy, once one of the most promising in Africa, was beginning to show cracks. Inflation was rising, unemployment was high, and rural families struggled with the harsh realities of droughts and limited opportunities. Yet alongside these challenges, there was also pride and optimism. Zimbabwe was still regarded as a relatively stable country compared to some of its neighbors, and education was highly valued. The Ariel school itself, located in the small town of Ruwa, about 20 kilometers outside Harare, was a product of this emphasis on learning. It catered to families of mixed backgrounds, local Zimbabweans, expatriates, and children whose parents worked in the capital city. The school was therefore a kind of cultural crossroads where children carried different traditions, beliefs, and worldviews into the same classroom and playground. This setting matters because context always shapes interpretation. In rural Zimbabwe, people were deeply connected to traditional beliefs about the spirit world, ancestral presences, and beings who might travel between realms. In Shona culture, for example, stories of spirits or visitors from beyond were not unusual. These cultural frameworks made the idea of beings not of this world easier to imagine than in more secular societies. At the same time, these children were growing up in a modern school influenced by Western structures of learning, Western media, and global narratives. They watched television, heard about space exploration, and were aware of stories about UFOs and extraterrestrials circulating far beyond Africa. The collision of these cultural currents, ancestral tradition, and global science fiction provided fertile ground for how the Ariel school sighting was later interpreted. Beyond cultural influence, the political environment also mattered. The government of Zimbabwe, in the 1990s, led by Robert Mugabe, maintained a firm grip on public discourse. The state was often suspicious of outside narratives and foreign journalists, especially when stories made the country appear weak, strange, or chaotic. For that reason, the Ariel school incident was not widely embraced or celebrated by officials. In fact, it was largely left to the children, their parents, the local community, and eventually international researchers to keep the story alive. This silence from the government created an unusual contrast. While global media picked up the incident and treated it as a serious UFO case, within Zimbabwe, the story lived more quietly, passed through word of mouth, interviews, and the occasional article. At the same time, the 1990s were witnessing a surge in global UFO interest. In the United States, popular culture was filled with alien themes. Television shows like The X-Files were capturing audiences, and debates about Area 51 and Roswell were entering mainstream conversations. Reports of sightings were frequent, and the idea of contact with extraterrestrials was becoming part of global pop culture. For the children of Ruwa, this meant that when something strange appeared in their schoolyard, they had both cultural and media references to draw upon. Some might frame the beings as spirits or creatures from the bush, while others described them as aliens in the language of Western science fiction. In this way, Zimbabwe in 1994 was not simply a backdrop, but an active ingredient in how the Ariel school encounter was understood. It was a society caught between worlds, the spiritual and the modern, the rural and the global, the hopeful and the uncertain. The children who stood together in the schoolyard that day carried all these influences in their minds, and when they saw something that defied explanation, they drew from both cultural memory and modern imagination to make sense of it. This does not diminish their accounts, it enriches them, because when dozens of children give testimony that aligns across cultural backgrounds, something profound is happening, something that transcends the ordinary categories of imagination or folklore. This historical stage setting is important for listeners to appreciate. The Ariel school sighting did not happen in a vacuum. It unfolded in a country balancing tradition and change, a continent often marginalized in global narratives, and a decade alive with both skepticism and fascination about UFOs. The combination of these elements explains why the story was both believable to some and dismissible to others. To many Zimbabweans, It felt like one more mystery in a land already alive with unseen forces. To skeptics abroad, it was easier to label it hysteria or misperception in a developing country. Yet the testimonies themselves, clear and consistent, refused to dissolve under either cultural lens. As we move from this broader context into the details of the sighting itself, we carry with us an understanding that the children's voices emerged from a unique environment, an environment where belief, imagination, and lived reality constantly overlapped. And it is precisely within that overlapping space where extraordinary stories take root and endure. September 16, 1994 began like any other Friday at the Ariel school in Ariel, Zimbabwe. Children gathered in classrooms, teachers prepared their lessons, and the morning sun cast its golden light across the dry fields surrounding the school. By late morning, anticipation was high for recess. For many students, it was a welcome chance to escape the heat of the classroom, to run freely across the playground, and to talk and laugh with friends. No one could have imagined that this ordinary break period would turn into one of the most remarkable collective sightings of unexplained phenomena ever recorded. When the bell rang, more than 60 children rushed outside, their voices carried over the open land, a mixture of laughter and chatter, as they scattered into smaller groups. Teachers remained indoors, leaving the children unsupervised for those few minutes. The school grounds themselves were bordered by stretches of bushland, low trees, dry grass, and scrub that seemed endless to young eyes. Beyond that natural border, the unexpected unfolded. Several children noticed a glint of light or movement in the distance. At first, it might have seemed like a reflection, or perhaps a piece of metal catching the sunlight, but soon more eyes turned toward the same area. What they reported next is astonishing in its detail and consistency. Children described seeing a strange, silver disc-shaped object descending from the sky, or already resting on the ground near the edge of the bush. Some insisted it hovered just above the earth, while others were certain it had landed. Whatever its exact position, the sight was unlike anything they had seen before. It was not a plane, not a helicopter, and not any familiar machine. The surface appeared shiny, metallic, and sleek, as though designed for a purpose no one there could imagine. The object alone was strange enough, but it was what accompanied it that would forever etch the day into memory. From near or beneath the craft, figures appeared, beings who did not resemble human adults or children. Many of the children later described them as small, perhaps 3 or 4 feet tall, with unusually large heads and large black eyes. Their movements seemed smooth, almost gliding, as they emerged from the bush and came closer to where the children stood. Accounts differ slightly in the details. Some children said they saw one being, others recalled 2 or even more, but the central image remained constant. Small, dark-clad figures, humanoid but not human, watching them in silence. Fear began to ripple through the playground. Some of the younger children ran away, crying, while others stood rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Older students, torn between terror and fascination, stayed to observe. What struck many of them most was not only the being's physical appearance, but also a strange sensation that seemed to accompany the encounter. Several children later said they felt as if thoughts were entering their minds, images and feelings that were not their own. They spoke of messages about the earth, warnings about environmental destruction, and a sense of urgency about how humanity was treating the planet. These impressions, vague yet powerful, were recalled by multiple students independently, lending weight to the idea of a shared telepathic experience. Each child's account had its own flavor, yet the overlap was striking. One girl said she felt overwhelmed by the creature's eyes, so dark and endless they seemed to draw her in. Another described a feeling of sadness or concern radiating from the being, as if it was trying to communicate without words. Some children were too afraid to get close, hiding behind bushes or watching from a safer distance. Others, braver or simply more curious, recalled standing only meters away, close enough to study the details of the being's clothing and movements. The descriptions varied slightly. Some said the figures wore tight, black suits. Others thought their bodies themselves were dark and featureless. But the sense of strangeness was undeniable. Time itself seemed to behave differently in those moments. Several children later remarked that everything felt slower, dreamlike, as though reality had bent around them. They could not say how long the encounter lasted. Some guessed it was only a few minutes. Others thought it might have been closer to 15. For children in the grip of fear and wonder, minutes can stretch into what feels like hours. What mattered more than duration was intensity, the certainty that they had seen something extraordinary, something impossible to explain, through ordinary logic. When the bell rang again, calling the children back inside, the spell was broken. They rushed to tell their teachers, their voices tumbling over one another with excitement and fear. At first, the adults were skeptical. Children had active imaginations, after all, and stories could spread quickly. But the consistency of the testimonies, the sheer number of children, insisting on what they had seen, made it difficult to dismiss. As teachers listened, they began to realize that something out of the ordinary truly had occurred. Some children drew pictures of the beings and the craft. These drawings, remarkably similar, despite being created independently, captured the essence of what they described: a disc-shaped object, small humanoid figures, with large heads, and the overwhelming presence of enormous black eyes. For the children, the encounter did not end with the return to class. Many were shaken, some deeply frightened. They struggled to focus on their lessons, replaying the scene in their minds. Some spoke to their parents later that day, repeating their accounts with the same conviction. The adults may not have seen what the children saw, but they could not ignore the sincerity in their voices, the fear in their eyes, and the urgency in their words. Something extraordinary had left its mark on them. This moment at Ariel School was unlike many other UFO reports, because of the witnesses themselves. Children, untrained in the ways of adult skepticism, spoke with honesty and rawness. Their accounts did not sound like rehearsed stories, but like vivid memories, fragmented yet deeply felt. This is why the Ariel School sighting has endured, because dozens of young voices, each telling the same essential story, created a collective testimony too compelling to ignore. The sighting itself, though brief, was powerful enough to remain with the children for the rest of their lives. In the days and weeks to come, their testimonies would draw the attention of researchers, journalists, and eventually, a Harvard psychiatrist who specialized in unusual human experiences. But in that moment, in the dusty playground of a rural Zimbabwean school, the encounter was theirs alone, a shared mystery carried in their young hearts and minds. The Ariel School sighting stands out in the vast catalog of UFO encounters, not simply because dozens of people witnessed it, but because those witnesses were children. The psychology of memory and perception in young people is both fascinating and complex, and it has played a central role in debates about what truly happened in RUW on that September morning in 1994. To understand why so many researchers, psychologists, and skeptics alike were drawn to the case, we must explore how children perceive unusual events, how memory works under stress, and why the Ariel testimonies resist easy dismissal. Children are often considered more impressionable than adults. Their imaginations are vivid, their understanding of the world less fixed, and their ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy still developing. In psychology, this is sometimes described as suggestibility. When one child shares an extraordinary idea, others might latch onto it, consciously or unconsciously reinforcing the narrative until it becomes a shared memory. This is one of the most common skeptical explanations for the Ariel sighting, that one or two imaginative children misinterpreted something, perhaps a glint of light, a passing vehicle, or even a local man in unusual clothing, and that fear and excitement spread through the group, cementing a collective illusion. But the Ariel School case complicates that theory. In studies of group memory, suggestibility usually creates variations in detail, with stories diverging wildly once retold by multiple people. Yet in RUW, the children's descriptions overlapped in remarkable ways. They independently drew similar pictures of a disc-like craft and beings with large heads and black eyes. They spoke of overwhelming emotions, fear, awe, paralysis, that matched across accounts. Even more unusual was the shared sense of telepathic communication, with several children insisting that messages about the environment had been placed in their minds. Suggestibility might explain excitement, but it struggles to explain such consistency, especially across different age groups and cultural backgrounds within the school. Psychologists have also pointed out that children, despite their vulnerability to influence, can be strikingly honest when describing what they believe they have seen. In legal contexts, children's testimony has been used in serious cases because, while imperfect, it is often delivered with sincerity and without the calculated deception adults sometimes practice. At Ariel, researchers who interviewed the students noted their emotional authenticity. Harvard psychiatrist Dr. John Mack, who later investigated the case, was particularly struck by the children's demeanor. They were not eager to impress. They seemed confused, frightened, and earnest. Their accounts carried the weight of genuine experience, rather than invention. Another psychological angle worth considering is the role of trauma and stress in shaping memory. When humans encounter something that triggers fear or shock, the brain often encodes the event with unusual vividness. Certain details may become sharper, almost etched into the mind, while others fade into blur. For the Ariel children, the sight of the being's large dark eyes, or the metallic shine of the craft, became the anchors of memory. These details recurred in testimony after testimony. Yet, as with many traumatic or extraordinary memories, the passage of time also introduced variations. Some children later emphasized certain aspects more than others, reflecting the way memory naturally reshapes itself with retelling. Cultural influence adds another dimension. Children in Zimbabwe were exposed to both traditional African beliefs and Western media. In local folklore, encounters with spiritual beings or ancestral spirits were familiar themes. At the same time, Western imagery of aliens, large heads, dark eyes, futuristic craft, had already circulated through television, film, and news stories. When children at Ariel described what they saw, skeptics argue they may have unconsciously borrowed from these cultural templates to interpret an unusual stimulus. Yet cultural borrowing alone cannot fully explain the emotional power of their stories. These were not casual descriptions, but accounts given with trembling voices, tearful eyes, and deep conviction. One detail often overlooked in psychological debates is the diversity of the children themselves. Ariel School hosted students from different racial, cultural, and national backgrounds. Some were local Zimbabweans, others the children of expatriates from Europe, Asia, or elsewhere in Africa. Despite these differences, their testimonies converged on the same essential story. In psychological research, diversity of witnesses usually reduces the chance of a uniform false memory, since individuals from different backgrounds interpret experiences differently. The fact that such a mixed group told such similar stories adds weight to the strangeness of the event. Skeptics, of course, highlight alternative psychological explanations. Mass hysteria, they argue, can grip groups, especially children, and create shared illusions of events that never occurred. Instances of fainting spells or phantom illnesses in schools have been documented around the world. But the Ariel case does not perfectly fit this model. Mass hysteria often arises from stress, fear of authority, or physical conditions like toxins or illness. At Ariel, the children were at recess, relaxed and playful, when the encounter occurred. There was no obvious trigger for hysteria, no sudden outbreak of illness or panic that spread like wildfire. Instead, what we see is a gradual recognition of something unusual, with children processing it in their own ways, some panicking, others remaining calm, all recounting the same core image. Ultimately, the psychology of the Ariel School sighting reveals more than it explains. Yes, children are impressionable. Yes, memory is imperfect, shaped by stress, culture, and suggestion. Yet the Ariel testimonies resist being neatly categorized as fantasy, illusion, or hysteria. Too many voices, too much emotional authenticity, and too much consistency remain. For psychologists, this creates a paradox. The very qualities that make children vulnerable to misperception also make them uniquely compelling witnesses. Their innocence, their lack of agenda, and their raw emotional honesty challenge the skeptic as much as they support the believer. In the calm analysis of psychology, one truth emerges: the Ariel school children experienced something they could not explain, and whether it was an external phenomenon or an internal construct, it became a deeply real event in their minds. For them, it was not a story borrowed from television or folklore, it was a memory carved into their lives. And that is why, decades later, the case continues to command attention. It invites us to ask not only what they saw, but how human perception itself shapes the boundary between the possible and the impossible. When word of the Ariel school sighting began to spread beyond the schoolyard and into the surrounding community, it quickly drew the attention of parents, journalists, and eventually researchers. At first, the story circulated quietly, passed along by children who told their families and by teachers who found themselves grappling with dozens of students, insisting on the same incredible experience. But soon, it became clear that this was not a fleeting playground tale. The sheer number of consistent testimonies, the intensity of the children's emotions, and the strange nature of the encounter caught the attention of outsiders who wanted to know more. Local journalists were among the first to respond. In Zimbabwe, stories of spirits and strange encounters were not entirely foreign, but this particular case, dozens of schoolchildren claiming to have seen a landed craft and beings, stood out. Reporters began interviewing children, photographing their drawings, and publishing accounts that quickly spread beyond Ruwa. The media's involvement ensured that the Ariel school sighting would not remain an isolated memory tucked away in a rural corner of the country. Instead, it became a documented case, preserved in print and film. One of the most valuable outcomes of this early coverage is that the testimonies were captured while the memories were fresh, before time or outside influence could reshape them. It was not long before the story reached international ears, and with that came the arrival of one of the most significant figures in the case, Dr. John Mack. A Harvard psychiatrist and Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Mack had spent years studying reports of alien abductions and encounters, a controversial focus that had already placed his academic career under intense scrutiny. Unlike many researchers in the UFO field, Mack was not dismissed as a fringe believer. He was a respected academic who took human testimony seriously, no matter how unusual the claims. To him, the Ariel school incident was not merely a curiosity but an opportunity to study a rare mass witness encounter involving children. Mack traveled to Zimbabwe, and alongside local colleagues and documentary filmmakers, began conducting interviews with the children. What set his approach apart was the sensitivity with which he treated the witnesses. He did not lead them with suggestive questions or dismiss their accounts as childish imagination. Instead, he invited them to speak openly, to draw what they saw, and to describe their feelings without judgment. Observers noted the remarkable consistency in their testimonies, even when the children were interviewed individually. Their fear, sincerity, and emotional reactions were evident. Mack later reflected that the children's authenticity was undeniable. Their wide eyes, trembling voices, and even their reluctance to speak about the encounter suggested a genuine experience that had shaken them deeply. Mack's involvement added both credibility and controversy to the case. On one hand, his reputation as a Harvard psychiatrist gave weight to the idea that the children's testimonies deserved serious consideration. On the other hand, his critics saw his presence as evidence that the story was being sensationalized by someone already sympathetic to the possibility of alien contact. Within academic circles, Mack's interest in UFOs had already drawn fire, leading Harvard University to launch an internal inquiry into his research practices. Though he was ultimately cleared of misconduct, the controversy underscored just how sensitive the subject of UFO encounters remained, even in the 1990s. Alongside Mack, other researchers and media outlets continued to document the case. BBC reporters filmed interviews with the children, capturing their unfiltered emotions on camera. Decades later, This footage remains some of the most compelling evidence of the Ariel school incident, showing young witnesses describing the beings in the craft with a mixture of fear and awe. Their body language, the nervous fidgeting, the serious expressions, the quick glances away from the camera, communicates as much as their words. For many who study UFO encounters, these recordings are invaluable because they offer raw, immediate testimony before adult memory, doubt, or reinterpretation could dilute the accounts. The media spotlight, however, also brought challenges. Parents and teachers worried about how the children would be perceived. In Zimbabwean society, as in many others, talking openly about encounters with strange beings risked ridicule. Some feared that the children would be dismissed as liars or dreamers, or that the story would attract unwanted attention from skeptics eager to tear it apart. Yet, despite these concerns, the children remained consistent in their accounts, often repeating them with the same conviction years later. The fact that so many of them maintained their stories into adulthood would later become one of the strongest arguments for the sincerity of the Ariel sighting. The arrival of John Mack and the global media turned what might have been a forgotten local mystery into one of the most studied UFO cases in modern history. It also marked a turning point in how UFO sightings were treated. Here was not a lone farmer, pilot, or traveler making an isolated claim, but dozens of children, who had no motive to deceive, describing the same extraordinary event. The combination of innocence and sincerity made the Ariel school case difficult to dismiss outright, even for hardened skeptics. At the same time, Mack's work raised broader questions about the role of psychiatry and science in addressing extraordinary claims. Should such encounters be treated as psychological phenomena, products of imagination and cultural influence, or should they be considered as possibly pointing toward realities science has not yet explained? Mack argued for the latter, suggesting that experiences of this kind might represent encounters with dimensions of reality not yet understood. To him, the children's testimonies were not simply psychological artifacts. They were windows into a mystery that challenged our assumptions about consciousness and existence. In many ways, the involvement of investigators and the media shaped the legacy of the Ariel school sighting as much as the event itself. Without Mack's documentation and the journalists' coverage, the story might have faded into local folklore, remembered only by those who were there. Instead, it became part of the global UFO narrative, cited in documentaries, books, and conferences as one of the most compelling mass witness cases on record. The calm but determined way Mack approached the children, combined with the raw honesty captured on film, ensured that the Ariel school incident would never be easily forgotten. It also highlighted the tension that surrounds all UFO research, the clash between skepticism and belief, science and mystery, ridicule and sincerity. From this moment onward, the Ariel sighting was no longer just a schoolyard story. It was a phenomenon placed under the brightest of spotlights, one that continues to intrigue researchers and inspire debate to this day. When the initial wave of interviews, investigations, and media coverage surrounding the Ariel school sighting settled, a new stage of the story began to unfold, the struggle to explain what had actually happened. For every witness account that seemed compelling, there arose skeptical voices searching for natural or psychological explanations. For every researcher convinced the children had experienced something extraordinary, there were critics determined to frame it as a case of mass hysteria, cultural suggestion, or the simple blending of childhood imagination with local folklore. This clash between belief and skepticism remains one of the defining features of the case, and it highlights the broader tensions that accompany all reports of UFO encounters. One of the most commonly raised skeptical explanations was that the sighting was the product of mass hysteria. Psychologists and critics argued that children, especially when gathered in large groups, are prone to shared suggestion. If a few children claimed to have seen something unusual, the excitement and fear could have spread quickly among their peers, amplifying the story until it became a shared conviction. Mass hysteria has been documented in schools and other group settings before, often triggered by stress, rumors, or misunderstandings. Skeptics pointed to these precedents and suggested that the Ariel case was another example. After all, they reasoned, The children were young, impressionable, and living in a region where stories of spirits and supernatural beings were part of the cultural landscape. Yet this explanation, while plausible on the surface, encountered difficulties when examined closely. Mass hysteria usually involves vague symptoms, dizziness, nausea, fainting, that spread quickly but lack a specific external trigger. What made Ariel different was the precision of the children's testimony. They did not merely express fear or unease. They described in detail the shape of a craft, the physical appearance of beings, and even the sense of communication through their eyes. Their drawings, collected independently, bore striking similarities: large heads, dark eyes, and slender bodies. These consistent details were harder to reconcile with the idea of spontaneous collective imagination. Psychologists who reviewed the case noted that while suggestion may have played some role, it did not fully account for the emotional depth and specificity of the children's accounts. Another explanation offered by skeptics was misidentification. Could the children have seen something mundane, perhaps a helicopter, a vehicle, or even a natural phenomenon, that they misinterpreted in the excitement of the moment? Rural Zimbabwe in the 1990s did not frequently see aircraft overhead, especially in areas like Arua. A helicopter landing near the school might have been unusual enough to spark fascination, but when investigators explored this possibility, it quickly fell apart. No records of helicopters or unusual aircraft were found in the area on that day. Moreover, the descriptions of silent movement, metallic surfaces, and the presence of humanoid figures did not align with any known aircraft. The possibility of misidentification seemed less convincing once all the eyewitness details were considered. Cultural influences provided another layer of interpretation. Zimbabwe, like many African nations, has rich traditions of spiritual and supernatural stories. Some skeptics suggested that the children, already immersed in a culture that included tales of spirits and otherworldly beings, might have interpreted something ambiguous through that lens. The idea of beings coming from the sky could, in theory, be influenced by local folklore. Yet others pointed out that the children's descriptions did not match traditional Zimbabwean spirit lore. Instead, they aligned more closely with the gray alien archetype already popularized in Western media by the 1990s. This raised another question: had Western depictions of aliens in television, film, and books seeped into the imaginations of children in rural Zimbabwe? By 1994, images of flying saucers and large-eyed aliens were already staples of global pop culture. If children had been exposed to such imagery, it might have influenced how they interpreted a strange event, or even how they constructed a story among themselves. But again, researchers noted problems with this argument. Many of the Ariel children came from rural families with limited access to Western media. While some had seen television programs or heard stories, others had not. Yet their testimonies remained strikingly consistent, regardless of cultural background. In interviews, some of the children even admitted they had never encountered the concept of aliens before. Their descriptions, therefore, seemed less likely to have been lifted directly from pop culture and more likely to stem from something they genuinely perceived. Supporters of the extraterrestrial hypothesis argued that the sighting bore all the hallmarks of a genuine encounter with an unknown phenomenon. To them, the consistency of the children's drawings, the emotional authenticity of their testimonies, and the lack of evidence for conventional explanations all pointed toward an extraordinary event. Proponents also highlighted the content of the children's reported telepathic messages, warnings about environmental destruction, and human responsibility. These themes resonated deeply with researchers like John Mack, who believed the experience went beyond mere sighting. To Mack, the encounter carried a symbolic, perhaps even spiritual dimension, as if the beings had chosen children as messengers for a broader truth about humanity's future. This interpretation was, of course, highly controversial. Critics accused Mack and others of reading too much into the testimonies, projecting adult anxieties about environmental collapse onto children's narratives. They argued that children may have unconsciously absorbed ideas about caring for the planet from school lessons or conversations, and that these ideas became entangled with their descriptions of the encounter. Yet even this critique left open an important question: why would dozens of children, at the same time fuse such ideas with a shared vivid account of strange beings and a landed craft. Alternative theories also emerged. Some speculated about secret military experiments, suggesting that advanced technology might have been tested in the region, inadvertently witnessed by the children. Others proposed psychological phenomena such as collective lucid dreaming or shared altered states of consciousness, though such theories remain speculative and difficult to prove. Each attempt to explain the sighting reflected broader debates about human perception, belief, and the limits of conventional science. Ultimately, the theories surrounding the Ariel school sighting reveal as much about the people debating them as they do about the event itself. Skeptics emphasize the fallibility of memory, the power of suggestion, and the influence of culture. Believers focus on the sincerity of witnesses, the consistency of their stories, and the possibility that we are not alone. Between these poles lies a space of ambiguity where the Ariel case continues to live, an unresolved mystery that resists tidy categorization. What makes this section of the story so compelling is that it mirrors the broader human struggle with the unknown. When faced with something extraordinary, we seek explanations that align with our worldviews. Those who believe in the possibility of extraterrestrial contact see the Ariel incident as one of the strongest cases on record. Those committed to skeptical reasoning see it as a fascinating but explainable example of human psychology and culture at work. And yet, decades later, neither side has produced definitive evidence to settle the debate. The Ariel school sighting, therefore, endures not just because of what happened on that September day in 1994, but because of the questions it continues to raise. What are the limits of human perception? How do belief and culture shape our experiences of reality? And most hauntingly, could it be that a group of children in rural Zimbabwe truly encountered beings from beyond our world, delivering a message that humanity has yet to fully hear? As the years passed, the Ariel school sighting took on a life of its own, growing far beyond the playground where it first unfolded. What began as the testimony of a group of children in rural Zimbabwe slowly became a cultural touchstone, referenced in books, documentaries, lectures, and even academic discussions about human consciousness and the possibility of contact with non-human intelligence. Its impact stretched across multiple domains, shaping how UFO encounters were perceived, influencing how Africa's role in the global UFO narrative was understood, and leaving lasting marks on the lives of the children who had once stood in that dusty schoolyard. One of the most striking aspects of the Ariel case is its endurance in memory and media. Unlike many UFO sightings that fade into obscurity after initial press coverage, this one continued to resurface. Documentaries revisited the school, journalists sought out witnesses decades later, and UFO researchers consistently cited it as one of the most credible encounters in history. The reason is simple. The story is compelling not only because of the number of witnesses, but also because they were children whose testimonies remained consistent into adulthood. Over time, the Ariel school sighting became shorthand for an unexplainable event that skeptics struggled to dismiss, and believers held up as near proof of contact. The case also carried cultural weight in Zimbabwe itself. For many, the incident challenged traditional understandings of the supernatural and spiritual. African folklore has long included stories of spirits, star beings, and ancestral messengers, but the Ariel sighting introduced imagery more associated with Western narratives of extraterrestrials, large-headed black-eyed beings, and metallic craft. This blending of cultural motifs sparked discussions about how global and local traditions intersect when faced with the unknown. Some scholars argued that the Ariel event illustrates how Western and African cultural lenses can overlap, producing hybrid interpretations of mystery. For Zimbabweans, the sighting became part of their national folklore, a story told and retold, somewhere between myth and memory. For the children themselves, the legacy was deeply personal. Many of them carried the experience with them into adulthood, and decades later they continued to affirm that what they saw was real. Interviews conducted years after the event show former students, now grown, still describing the beings and the strange sense of communication they felt. Some said it shaped their worldview, making them more aware of humanity's responsibility to care for the earth. echoing the environmental messages they believed were conveyed. Others admitted that it left them with questions they could never fully answer, an unresolved thread in the fabric of their lives. The persistence of their conviction, even after decades, became a cornerstone of the case's credibility. Unlike fleeting childhood memories that often fade or change, this one seemed etched deeply, immovable even against the erosion of time. The cultural impact also extended internationally. UFO researchers began pointing to Ariel as one of the best documented mass sightings ever recorded. Documentaries such as The Phenomenon and later independent projects returned to the story, highlighting its continued relevance. The footage of children being interviewed in 1994, wide-eyed, nervous, but earnest, proved invaluable. For many viewers, seeing the raw emotions of the children firsthand removed layers of doubt that written reports could not. It is one thing to read about a UFO encounter, another entirely to watch a child speak of it with trembling sincerity. The videos became cultural artifacts in their own right, replayed in conferences, online forums and television specials. At the same time, the Ariel school sighting entered the broader conversation about UFOs in Africa. Historically, most famous UFO reports had come from the United States, Europe, or Latin America. Africa's stories often received less attention, dismissed by global media, or overshadowed by Western cases. Ariel changed that. It positioned Zimbabwe, and Africa more broadly, at the center of one of the most important UFO narratives of the late 20th century. Scholars of culture and anthropology have since argued that this was significant. It demonstrated that UFO encounters, if genuine, are not bound by geography or culture. They are a global phenomenon, appearing in places as remote as Roa and as urban as New York City. The case also left a mark on how people think about childhood testimony. Typically, children's accounts are viewed with skepticism, seen as unreliable or overly imaginative. But the Ariel witnesses, through their consistency and the sheer number of them, forced researchers to reconsider. Here were dozens of children telling nearly identical stories independently, their emotions raw and uncoached. Over time, this contributed to a broader re-evaluation of how children's voices are weighed in extraordinary claims. While skeptics still raise concerns about suggestibility, Ariel remains a unique example of young witnesses whose accounts withstood decades of scrutiny. Culturally, the Ariel school incident came to symbolize the unresolved mystery at the heart of the UFO phenomenon. It straddled two worlds, the rational demand for evidence and the human yearning for wonder. To believers, it was a message delivered in innocence, a moment when humanity came closest to hearing voices from beyond. To skeptics, it was a case study in psychology and belief systems, a cultural mirror reflecting our fears and hopes. To those caught between, it was simply a story, one that could not be easily explained away, yet could not be definitively proved. Decades later, its legacy remains strong, not because it answered questions, but because it kept them alive. The Ariel school sighting continues to be discussed in conferences, featured in films, and studied by researchers precisely because it resists closure. It represents the liminal space where mystery endures, where science, culture, and personal testimony intersect without resolution. For those who use stories like this to drift into sleep, it offers a calm yet haunting reminder. Sometimes the unknown visits us in the most ordinary places, leaving traces that ripple across generations. In the decades that followed the Ariel school sighting, the story did not simply fade into obscurity as many UFO encounters do. Instead, it lingered, resurfacing in new investigations, documentaries, and even government reports. Modern researchers, journalists, and filmmakers continue to return to Ruwa, sometimes traveling across continents to track down the now adult witnesses. These renewed investigations help to solidify the Ariel school sighting as one of the most enduring and puzzling cases in UFO history. Unlike a fleeting news headline, it became a case study, a touchstone in the ongoing effort to understand what humanity might be dealing with when it comes to unidentified aerial phenomena. In recent years, especially with the renewed global interest in UFOs sparked by declassified U.S. military footage and official government acknowledgement of unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, the Ariel school case has gained fresh attention. What once seemed like an isolated event in rural Zimbabwe is now often cited alongside high-profile military sightings, radar-verified encounters, and pilot testimonies. Researchers argue that if governments are finally admitting that unidentified objects exist in the skies, then mass witness events like Ariel deserve to be revisited with the same seriousness. The timing has made the Ariel case feel less like an anomaly and more like part of a larger ongoing pattern that spans decades and continents. Modern investigations have taken multiple forms. Documentaries like The Phenomenon, 2020, and upcoming independent films have revisited the school and tracked down witnesses. Many of the children, now adults living across the world, continue to affirm what they saw. Some admit that they tried to suppress the memory in order to live normal lives, while others say it profoundly shaped their worldview, making them more spiritual, more environmentally conscious, or more open to mysteries beyond human understanding. Their conviction, even after years of living under skepticism and ridicule, is perhaps the most striking element of these modern interviews. For many viewers, hearing adults describe their childhood experiences with the same unwavering detail is deeply compelling. Technology has also allowed the case to reach new audiences. Archival footage of the children's original testimonies has been digitized and circulated online, bringing fresh eyes to the decades-old evidence. These videos, showing children trembling, wide-eyed and clearly unsettled, have gone viral at times, sparking renewed debates on social media platforms and online forums. Unlike second-hand retellings, these recordings allow modern viewers to judge the sincerity of the witnesses for themselves. The immediacy of the children's fear and the consistency of their descriptions resonate strongly in an era where video evidence is often considered more persuasive than written testimony. At the same time, modern skeptics have not remained silent. Some psychologists have re-examined the case, suggesting that the collective experience might still be understood in terms of mass suggestion, cultural influence, or shared childhood imagination. They point out that UFO reports often spike during times of social stress or heightened awareness, and Zimbabwe in the 1990s was undergoing significant political and economic changes. Stress, uncertainty, and exposure to fragmented media representations could have shaped the children's perceptions. Others suggest that as the witnesses grew older and the case gained more media attention, their memories may have been unconsciously reinforced or reshaped, blurring the line between original experience and later retelling. Still, these skeptical arguments continue to face the same obstacles they did in 1994, the specificity and consistency of the testimonies. In most cases of supposed mass hysteria, the details vary wildly or fade quickly over time. Yet here, even decades later, former students independently describe the same beings, the same craft, and the same profound sense of communication. For many researchers, this persistence remains one of the most difficult aspects to dismiss. Modern scientific frameworks have also begun to shift the conversation. With the rise of serious UAP studies within government agencies, academic institutions, and private organizations, the Ariel school sighting has been reframed as part of a broader dataset of unexplained phenomena. Some researchers have suggested that the event could be re-examined using contemporary tools such as psychological analysis, cross-cultural studies, and even cognitive science to better understand how groups of people process extraordinary experiences. Others propose that the Ariel case may be part of a larger phenomenon that blurs the line between physical and psychological reality, hinting at mysteries not yet captured by current scientific models. The continuing mystery of the Ariel school sighting lies not only in what the children saw, but in what the story has become. Each new investigation adds layers, not clarity. Witnesses remain steadfast, skeptics remain unconvinced, and the broader world continues to hover between fascination and doubt. The case has become less about proving what happened on that September morning, and more about exploring what it means when dozens of children share an unexplainable encounter. Is it evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, proof of the human mind's capacity for collective creation, or a message that transcends simple categories of belief and disbelief? Ultimately, modern investigations have ensured that the Ariel school sighting has not been forgotten. Instead, it has grown into a living mystery, one that adapts to each new era of inquiry, each wave of cultural curiosity, and each generation of believers and skeptics. It endures not because it provides answers, but because it continues to ask questions, whispering across time from a quiet schoolyard in Zimbabwe to a world still struggling to understand its place in the cosmos. As we reach the final stretch of this story, it becomes clear that the Ariel school sighting is not just an isolated incident tucked into the past. It is a living mystery that continues to ripple through time, shaping conversations about what it means to encounter the unknown. Reflection brings us back to the quiet schoolyard in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, where children once stood in a circle, pointing toward the trees and describing something so extraordinary that it would follow them for the rest of their lives. Their voices, captured on camera and preserved through decades, still speak to us with a sincerity that is difficult to dismiss. And in those voices, there lies a profound tension between comfort and unease. Comfort in the knowledge that they were not alone in their experience. Unease in the possibility that something beyond human understanding truly did brush against their lives. For those who seek to use this story as a guide into sleep, it serves another purpose as well. The pacing of the Ariel school mystery invites the mind to wander. The dusty playground, the midday sun, the frightened but curious faces of children, all of it unfolds like a dream, slow and vivid, fading into the edges of consciousness. In this way, the story becomes not only a record of unexplained events, but also a meditation on mystery itself. Falling asleep with such a narrative means carrying into dreams a reminder that the universe is vast and filled with unanswered questions. The unknown, far from being frightening, can be strangely soothing, a vast horizon upon which the mind can rest. Philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual thinkers who have revisited the Ariel case often frame it in symbolic terms. Whether or not extraterrestrial beings truly landed in Ruwa, the event carries meaning. The children reported messages of environmental care, of responsibility toward the earth, of a need for humanity to look inward before it looks outward. These themes resonate deeply in a world still grappling with ecological crises and questions of survival. Even if one were to see the Ariel sighting as a product of imagination or shared psychology, the message at its heart is one that continues to hold relevance. In that sense, the sighting transcends the need for proof. It becomes a parable for our time, a story that gently reminds us of our responsibilities and vulnerabilities. And yet there is also the haunting possibility that what happened was not symbolic at all but literal, that something did descend from the skies that day, observed by dozens of witnesses, and left behind only questions. If this is true, then the Ariel case stands as one of the most significant contact events in modern history, one that was witnessed by the most unlikely of groups, school children, with no motive to deceive, no complex agendas, only their honest reactions to what they saw. This idea, while difficult to prove, remains lodged in the minds of many researchers. It lingers because it feels so improbable, and yet so consistent in the details. As with all great mysteries, the Ariel school sighting rests in ambiguity. Perhaps it was mass imagination, perhaps it was contact, perhaps it was both, something that exists in a liminal space between mind and reality, between belief and disbelief. What is certain is that the case endures, refusing to fade, because it speaks to the deepest parts of the human spirit, our curiosity, our fear, our longing for connection, and our wonder at the vastness beyond us. And so, as you settle deeper into rest, this story becomes less about answers and more about questions. What does it mean to encounter something inexplicable? How do we carry mystery in our lives without demanding closure? Can the voices of children from a quiet Zimbabwean schoolyard remind us that the unknown is not something to fear, but something to contemplate? Perhaps as the night deepens, the Ariel school sighting offers not resolution but perspective, a reminder that mystery is a natural companion to existence, and that even in our most ordinary places, the extraordinary may one day touch us. With those thoughts, the story comes to a gentle close. The schoolyard grows quiet again. The children return to their classrooms. The sun hangs in the sky, unbothered, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. And yet, for those who carry the memory, the world is no longer quite the same. Drifting into sleep, you too may carry a piece of that mystery, resting on the thin line between the known and the unknown, between the safety of dreams and the vast silence of the cosmos.